Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a frontline update for the 8th of March 2023 for the Ukraine war. Let's get straight to it and go to the northeast sector of the front lines, Kupiansk to Svatva to Kremina. Relatively quiet as a general synopsis. If we go to Dvorichna, there's talk about a repelled Ukrainian attack in Hranikivka. The ISW says geolocated, it talks about unsuccessful offensives near Hranikivka, Nevska, and Belorivka and Shpirna. So that's going all the way down south past Kremina. So really, there aren't very many places to talk about. It does say geolocated footage published on March 7th depicts Russian forces storming and capturing Ukrainian positions northwest of Kremina. Indicates limited Russian advances. Luhansk Oblast administration head Serhiy Haidai stated that Russian forces are unable to capture Stelmakivka and Nevska. And geolocated footage published on March 7th shows Ukrainian artillery striking 5 Russian tanks near Chervonopopivka, indicating that the further degradation of Russian mechanized forces in the area. Now, I showed you that video footage, 5 main battle tanks, talked about it in the news this morning segment, and that suggests, okay, so if we come out, let's talk about all those points, actually. If we come down south, Serhiy Haidai says they're unable to take Stelmakivka and Nevska down here, and that there are degraded Russian capabilities or capacity of mechanized equipment, 5 main battle tanks being taken out here. The talk is whether that was a staging point for an offensive or whether the Ukrainians had actually advanced in the area. It's probably the former there. I don't think the Ukrainians have advanced particularly there, so they just hit that successfully. No report says Serhiy Haidai reported on Luhansk, which ties in with our report from yesterday. The fighting on the Russian side has slowed down, and there are reports that Russian troops are being repositioned to Bakhmut around Chervonopopivka. The AFU has regained ground. I don't have any information that they've regained ground, and that would be probably concerning those main battle tanks. I think that's a hit. I don't know that they've regained ground. They might have done. Nearby, however, they have lost some ground, and this ground in these 2 fields here, broadly speaking, we have some footage of that. This is what the ISW is talking about. This link there has a couple of posts, and it goes to a telegram. So it's been geolocated to this position, which I have on my map. So this is where you're just about to see some activity of tanks moving towards this point and some troops offloading, I presume from tanks, or they could be from IFVs, and that is, as I say, geolocated to this position and referencing a video in Telegram. So I'm now going to show you that video in Telegram if I can work out how to do this. Here we go. Here is the I'll turn up, it's just music in the background. So this is those fields we're talking about, moving towards this tree line over here ahead of you, and there is some kind of vehicle that's been taken out in that tree line there, which is actually to the west. Troops offloading here and then clearing out some trench lines in this forested area, or I say forested area, in this tree line, sorry. And there's just a few Ukrainians in foxholes there. You can't really see much that goes on for the rest of this. There's nothing inappropriate. A tank arrives for a bit of support. Troops are getting off the back of the tank, so they're riding on the tanks by the looks of it, as opposed to it being an IFE or anything like that. There's a Ukrainian. So I don't know there's too much of a defense going on here, but it does look like the Russians have taken out a vehicle in that tree line previously. Anyway, there's a bit of activity. It's the sort of thing you might expect when you have claims about, I mean, I show you this to give you an understanding of, what the claims are when areas are being cleared out. All right, let's get back to the map. Right, sorry about that, tech, hey? So geolocated Russians there, so they were driving towards that tree line, and what that means is that this area that was under Ukrainian control yesterday, it can now be there's now evidence it's under Russian control, and that is the evidence. So that's how you move things on a map. You look at these sources, you verify the claims, and you move lines on a map. So anyway, that's going on just there. So I don't think that there is movement for the Ukrainians eastwards, as far as no reports is saying. But I do think there's evidence to suggest that Russians have moved westwards there. So that's what I will do. So the weather is looking to warm up and start to get muddy. We can see it was still cold in that footage we just seen, but it does look to be on the move towards warmth and therefore mud, the thawing of snows and rains to come. So the Defmon pro-Ukrainian source says the Ukrainians have repulsed attacks in Frankivka, Nevska, Bilorivka, and Spirina, just parroting there what the general staff have said, I guess. And then we kind of move on to Bakhmut. So if we come down here, past Kremina, obviously tough fighting going on around Kremina. There is not too much to report. Haidai stated that Russian forces have increased the number of attack waves in the Kremna and Bilorivka directions. So there is, consistently tough fighting around there. And then we come further down south. No movement on these lines at all, although there is fighting, repelled attacks around Spirina again. And then we get to Bakhmut that we've talked about so much over the last few days. Of course, I mentioned this in my news piece, but I forgot to say it here. Those 5 main battle tanks, so 5 tanks were taken out just around Chivona Popivka, and that's what Noah Reports is talking about, whether that signifies, I think that's what he's talking about, whether that signifies gained ground for the Ukrainians there, but I don't think it does. I think that's probably long-distance attacks on that, spotted by drones. Right, some general talk about Bakhmut. There's been so much discussion over the last couple of days. The ISW says that it continues to assess, however, that Russian forces lack the capability to exploit the tactical capture of Bakhmut to generate operational effects and will likely rapidly culminate following the capture of Bakhmut. I've said this previously some time ago, saying that the Wagner were likely going to culminate. Well, I was reporting what the ISW were assessing. I was called out yesterday by a pro-Russian on the thread saying, well, you said they were going to culminate before. That didn't happen. It's like, that didn't happen, but it's not that the ISW is wrong. What happened is the Russians did something to mitigate that. This is a very different thing. So Wagner, had they not been supported by VDV and regular Russian forces and DPR that was sent into the area at the time that they were claimed to be culminating, then they would have culminated. Wagner basically, according to Prigozhin himself, run out of troops and ammunition, right? That is basically the definition of culmination. So and that's having been supported by regular Russian troops now for some time. If they hadn't been supported by those troops, they would have got to this point, or they were at this point previously when the ISW said they were. So it's not that the ISW are wrong, it's that Russia did something to mitigate the onset of culmination for the Wagner forces. Really important that people don't misinterpret and misrepresent. I mean, I banned that person now for just repetitive accusations that are not worthy of my threads. Russian forces additionally likely lack the mechanized forces necessary to advance beyond Bakhmut, and the tactical assault detachments used in assaults against Bakhmut are likely unable to conduct maneuver warfare. The continuing devolution of Russian force structure towards small assault detachments using simplified attacks combined with mounting losses among the most effective Russian troops will likely greatly limit the ability of Russian forces to properly exploit any paths of advance opened by the capture of Bakhmut. Russian forces remain unlikely to secure more than a tactical victory following 10 months of assaults. Okay, what all this means is that just exactly what I've been saying for some time now, that once or if the Russians take Bakhmut, they will likely culminate and have expended their forces so that they will be unable to, at least rapidly advance from Bakhmut. They would need to reconstitute, need to get a whole bunch more equipment and troops into the area in order to advance onto Chasiv Yar and all these other places around here, let alone Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Malotorinivka, and Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. However, yesterday, Zelensky did say that that there is some kind of operational value for Bakhmut, and I think he's saying this to try and kind of scare people into supporting Ukraine or keeping the support for Ukraine up, and to justify throwing troops into Bakhmut to stop it from being immediately captured by the Russians. So he's saying that if Bakhmut is taken, then that will give an open corridor basically for the Russians to attack these places. And to a degree, that is correct. Like, you cannot attack these places realistically without taking Bakhmut. If you didn't have this entire area there, then, you know, how are you going to effectively attack Konstantinivka? So it is, of course, important for the fall of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk for the Russians that Bakhmut falls. I mean, that's, if you're going to take Donbass, you have to take the Donbass, right? You can't just leave big parts of it. So Bakhmut will have to fall for the Russians. So Zelensky is right. Whether he's doing that to justify remaining in place there. There are all these different theories flying around. There are new figures that have come out. A press conference yesterday for journalists in the West has said that between 20 and 30,000 Russian casualties have taken place in Bakhmut alone, and they're estimating at I think a 1 to 2 to 1 to 3 killed to wounded ratio. So they're saying it's higher than the usual 1 to 3 that Russians are suffering elsewhere, which is also pretty high. So let's say 1 to 2. So if they have lost 30,000 casualties, 10,000 of those will be dead, which is considerable, and the estimates for the Ukrainians are significantly less, they said. So if you take that as being something near the truth, then this is why they're holding on to Bakhmut, because it is grinding the Russian forces down whilst also grinding Ukrainians down, but just not at the same rate, and that is deemed as an acceptable calculation that justifies staying in Bakhmut. However, there are also some claims that special forces are operating around these main supply routes, and normally you put your special forces around there if you are if you are doing retrograde action, so that you are doing an operational withdrawal. You would secure those main supply routes to get out your personnel. It's what the Russians did in Kherson, and it could be what the Ukrainians are doing, which is saying we need to keep Bakhmut, Bakhmut all at the same time as withdrawing your forces from there. So a bit of deception to get your forces out and get them to Chasiv Yar. So although Zaluzhny and Zelensky might be saying we are going to keep Bakhmut because we don't want all these places to fall and it would be an open corridor, then they could just be saying that for the purposes of the Russians, so that they can do have a better chance of doing a successful withdrawal. It's difficult to know. As far as the claims about Bakhmut, let's have a look at. We'll go to Rebar first, I guess. Sorry, I'm flicking around here. So the first thing to note of Rebar on Telegram is that they only mention Shriyanikivka and then come straight down to Bakhmut. So there's nothing from Kupiansk down to Bakhmut. They don't mention it at all. In Bakhmut, Wagner PMC groups are close to the road to Chasiv Yar via Kromova. The highway is under fire control, making it difficult for the AFU to exit the city. In the central districts, of Wagner PMC groups are sweeping low-rise buildings on the left bank of the Bakhmutovka River. Despite the threat of complete encirclement, the enemy is strengthening its defences on the opposite bank. South near Zabakhmutka, Russian assault groups are advancing in the area of Karla Marxa Street. At the same time, Wagner PMC groups managed to expand their zone of control in the industrial area. And it goes on, and in fact, a bit more detail when they do a separate post for Bakhmut. That Yevgeny Prigozhin, he was actually in Bakhmutka. There's video of Bakhmut. There's video of him next to that tank. Steeler, that tank, what do you call it, statue thing, that is monument, that's in on the eastern suburbs of Bakhmut, and just in the very early morning, so it's probably the safest time he was there sort of filming. And it says, fighting continuing all across the south, but that at the same time, the Ukrainian command continues to partially withdraw troops from the city along dirt roads under constant artillery shelling and airstrikes, which is interesting because they're also saying that they're reinforcing the eastern bank. So there's perhaps this shows that Rebar don't really know what the Ukrainians are doing. So at one time they are apparently withdrawing troops out of Bakhmut through these dirt roads to the back, and at the same time they are strengthening the eastern bank, the western bank of the Bakhmutivka River. Make of that what you will. Defmon saying that the airfield have repulsed attacks around Fedorivka, Zalizhnyansky, Yahidny, Ivanovsky, and 37 attacks near the village of Dubovo-Vasilivka alone, according to the UA General Staff. The Ukrainians have slowed down or even stopped the Russian advance in the north. By stopped, I mean Russian armed forces have not made much progress for the last few days. In the south, the Ukrainians successfully defended T-0504 road. The Russians are probably 2 to 3 kilometers from the road without a line of sight. This does not make it safe to travel on the road. So there are sort of maybe conflicting reports, some saying that the Ukrainians have successfully pushed the Russians back from this southern road, and that in the north there's not really much movement. There is talk that there's not a lot of movement here because the river has been flooded. They still haven't seen any footage of the flooding here, but that would make sense because really the Russians have not moved particularly in this northern area here. They've made small gains around Bakivka and Bodanivka. In fact, if we go and look at Syriac maps, you can see, although it's rotated 90 degrees annoyingly, so this is the west, this is the east, this is north, and this is south. So there are some elements of expansion there. Interestingly, I had all of those on my map yesterday, so I don't think that's particularly up to date in that respect. And then talking about other areas, let's have a little look. I don't think there are any other areas because it goes down to Avdivka after that. Yeah, so that's pretty representative that things aren't going as quickly for the Russians as maybe they might have hoped. We're going to, just after I go to Null Reports, I'm going to read you some Kenneth Gregg, but let's get Null Reports in first. No reports a pro-Ukrainian source says it's a quiet day in Bakhmut. The situation hasn't changed. Russian troops are entrenched in the southernmost part of Orikovo-Vasilivka and are trying to gain a foothold in Zalizhnyansky. I'll show you these on a map in a second. Control of this village is required for further advance along the M03 north. In the city itself, no attacks by Russian troops. Russian troops were observed on the northeast side. This makes sense as the AFU has now entrenched itself behind the natural barrier of the river. To the west, the AFU counterattacked at Kromova and pushed Russians back at least 1 kilometer, which is not quite what was said by Rebar. So there are different claims as to what is going on. You can see that large body of water there, and no reports are saying a large area of land. That is, let's go and find that. So this is the body of water there, and no reports is saying that actually this area of land here is taken back by Ukraine, or at least somewhere, something like that. That is pretty significant. So sort of halfway along, 3/4 way along there. So that is, pretty significant if that has happened, and that gives them something of a breather with regard to this main supply route, the 00506 through Kromove. That's exactly what they'd need, but I'd want some kind of confirmation of that. It seems to be all about these areas of Dubovo, Vasilivka there, so lots of attacks on that. Bodanivka, Kromova, and this settlement up here, Orikovo, Vasilivka. So and Zalizhnyansky as well. So if the Russians want to advance along this highway, towards, basically towards Sloviansk, but they will need to take obviously all of these settlements. But at the moment, it's these two. Zalizhnyansky has actually held out for some time. If you think after Solidar fell, and then they were moving towards first of all the railway line, and then the the road and then this kind of waterway that goes along here, and they've been there now for I don't know several weeks, and Zaluzhnitsky just hasn't budged. So that's obviously a fairly useful area for the Ukrainians there. But yeah, the claims of territory changing hands is not noted, particularly in ISW. Just lots of attacks being repelled, etc., etc., etc. Quite a lot of information in there. What is interesting is Wagner Group financier Prigozhin has claimed that the Wagner Group has killed 11,000 Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut over the course of February. It's 11,000. So that would be at a wounded ratio of 3-1. Let's guess at that. That would be 40,000 Ukrainian troops taken out of Bakhmut in February alone, 1 month, 28 days. And other Russian sources also amplified claims of high Ukrainian losses. I mean, if that was the case, they would have pulled out. I'm pretty certain. Or if that is the case, if they had lost 40,000, then I'm imagining the Russians would have lost 80,000. So they are still there, and they're still there for I'm pretty sure a fairly sound reason, at least. So that I thought was worthy of mention. Now, again, the Kiev Independent has a very interesting article of someone who is, or I think several people who were positioned in Bakhmut brigade that spent 2 months in Bakhmut. It was becoming harder each week. They pulled out. These guys were rotated out. In when Soledar fell. So actually, they haven't been there for some weeks now. But that is an interesting read. Gives you the other side of the story and shows how difficult it is for the Ukrainian soldiers. I won't go through that now. I might save that for an extra. Let's go on to Kenneth Gregg, and this plays into what Ukraine, reporting from Ukraine was saying the other night, which is it looks like this could be the setting for a counterattack, maybe trapping the Russians or lulling them into a false sense of security and then hitting them both north and south. There does seem to be a stopping of the Russians, slowing down, and there are claims that there are counterattacks taking place and that the Russians have been pushed back to some degree. Well, Kenneth Gregg here, who is a Swedish person fighting in Ukraine, says, and again, take his claims with a pinch of salt, the update could be entitled, "Has our General Staff come up with an ingenious plan to surround Wagner? Yesterday, it became completely clear that we are not leaving Bakhmut in the near future. Now I'm also allowed to hand out some more information. So let's start by seeing what the troops we have here and how many of them. North of Bakhmut, the New River has made it impossible for the Russians." So the New River, so this is talking about the flooding. So seeming to claim that flooding is making it, he claims, impossible for the Russians to advance. In the south, we have a lock from Chasiv Yar and Ivanivska, which means that the Russians cannot advance. This has been clear for a long time and is public information. Then to the new info. We have brought in elite troops to Sloviansk and Siviersk. Wagner has observed this and is now trying to advance on the road between Sloviansk and Soledar. This scenario is as follows. If Wagner surrounds Bakhmut, we can in turn surround Wagner by advancing our elite troops from Sloviansk and Siviersk in the north with the help of our Azov troops in Chasiv Yar and Konstantin. This is done through 4 attack vectors plus a hedgehog defense in the city. Okay, so let's zoom out here. So they have, according to him, crack troops in Siviersk and Sloviansk, and if Bakhmut gets surrounded, or if they take Bakhmut, then they can send in these elite troops, and with the help of those in Konstantinivka and Chasiv Yar, they can then surround the Wagner, maybe by hitting down here, and I don't know, enveloping those. Sometimes it's useful to wait until an offensive has taken place, in this case on Bakhmut, so with the Russians expending themselves, taking Bakhmut, and then you hit them with a counter, and ideally completely wipe them out, that kind of thing. It's not necessarily about sending in the people while the attack is taking place. The fact that Wagner has not been able to advance as before in 4 days indicates that they are afraid of this. Even the Grand Chef, as Prigozhin himself, has expressed the obvious risk that the Russians' war operations in the area may collapse. And this is true, he has said that. The ingredients are in place. Now they just need to be mixed in the right proportions and baked to the right temperature. There are a few more things in the pipeline, but they are classified. The defense of Bakhmut has so far consisted of thinning. Now the official figure of 1 to 7 arrived, which actually agrees well with my investigation results last time I was in Bakhmut. During the day, the ratio was 1-8 with the battalion I followed. Okay, so he's claiming that the figures being lost are 1 Ukrainian to 7 Russians, and he stands by that. He says that when he was in Bakhmut, it was 1-8. So that would broadly be aligned with that. It goes back to these claims that are being bandied around by Western intelligence and military outlets and sources that are being picked up by CNN, so on and so forth. So we're hearing 1-5, 1-7 quite consistently. And then Prigozhin is maybe countering that with 11,000 Ukrainians have died in February. Who to believe, I leave that to you. Another thing to consider about the defense of Bakhmut is that it ties up huge manpower resources for the Russians away from the Kremlin front. In this regard, Bakhmut is of strategic importance until our new heavy weapons arrive. Pretty much exactly what I've been saying recently. Poulet-Volon maps, nice and clear, show you not a lot of movement in the front lines, but pressure all along there from Bilorivka and the forests of Serebryantski down to Bakhmut. And indeed, as we can see here, Bakhmut with Dubovo-Vasilivka not under Russian control. I did have that under Russian control, don't anymore. That seems to be holding out fairly well. And as I said, Zalizhnyansky as well. And then really all around the city staying fairly stable. I think this line here is where you've got flooding coming from this reservoir down to the river, which is possibly why you have not seen any movement in that area. The Ukrainians have relinquished land to the east of the river, so now the river is the new front line here, and that is useful as long as they can't be flanked from the south and the north. But if they've flooded this area to north, then maybe there's a natural river here as well, which means that they need to make sure they can't be flanked from the south. And as Rybar said, there is a lot of fighting in the south. But as you can see here, the Russians have lost ground near Ivaniska. That was previously held ground there, and although they are putting pressure on in these areas, there are also claims that the Ukrainians are countering around there as well. So that's that really for Bakhmut. We'll see what happens over the next 24, 48 hours, see whether the Ukrainians really are settling in for a proper defense of Bakhmut, whether they'll be mounting counterattacks, or whether they are indeed just preparing for an operational withdrawal. All those options, I think, are still on the table. I don't know what's going to happen. You would assume they'll make the best decision with the available information, and sometimes decisions are made that seem nonsensical to us, but then we don't have the on-the-ground information, and you assume they are going to make the best decisions with that information. Right. And in fact, that leads me. Someone questioned why I was saying that when the Ukrainians throw in untrained recruits mobilized here without much equipment, why do I not call the Ukrainians out on that, and yet I call the Russians out when there are all these videos of untrained, etc., being sent to the front lines? That's a really good question, and I never actually said it was morally right to send in the untrained. All I did was explain why they've been doing it, so that they can not dip into their reserves that are being trained up to do the counteroffensives. Whether that's a morally right thing to do, I don't know, but I would assume there wasn't a better option, because otherwise they would have done that. If they take troops from other places, then those other places would be undermanned, and you'd have to throw in untrained mobilized into there. So I presume that the calculation is we've got 3 types of troops. We've got those that are fighting on the front line, those that are in the reserves getting trained up for a big counteroffensive, and you want your best troops to counterattack. And then we've got newly mobilized troops that really aren't very well trained up and don't have the right equipment yet. Who do we send in to Bakhmut to help? Well, actually, mobilized troops, defending is the easiest job. So this is what I was hearing yesterday, is that you want your best troops to attack. So there's no point putting your best troops out from being trained up to do these counter offensives and pull them into a defensive position in Bakhmut. So they have pulled in these less trained, less well trained mobilized troops to Bakhmut, because actually it is within their capabilities to do that, even though it's not ideal. And sometimes you have to make suboptimal decisions, or they're the best decision you can make with what you've got at the time in war, and it's not perfect. And in an ordinary world, you wouldn't put in under-trained troops into Bakhmut, but I presume that that is their only option at the moment, with the view that they want to keep their counteroffensive potential as good as it can be. Anyway, that's my thought there. That's not to excuse the Ukrainians, but have doubled standards and not excuse the Russians. I think the Russians are just mobilizing troops who are unwilling and then throwing them into war they don't want to be in and don't need to be in. And I think it's a whole different kettle of fish. Right, Avdiivka, sorry. Okay, the truth about Avdiivka, as far as I can see it, is that it is cloudy, it is foggy, as in I'm not quite sure what's going on. There are some contradictory claims. If you look at, say, Poulet-Volon's map, you've got this area to the north near Krasnohorivka and Vesele that they have said the Russians have lost. I was saying this yesterday, that some mappers have that. So Andrew Perpetua saying that has been lost. Pro-Russian mappers are saying actually that is still there, and indeed Deep State still has that in Russian hands. And likewise, down here to the south by Severny and north of Vodyanny, there was Russians knocking on the door of Severny and then having lost a bunch of ground. And then today, Syriac pro-Russian mapper saying, well, they're still up in Krasnohorivka area and have actually gained some since then. And they've regained some of the land that was lost in Severny. So they did lose it. They had it. They lost it. They've got a bit more. So, you know, what do you say around here? The ISW just says there's lots of different claims. Claims by Russians, claimed by Ukrainians, repelled, gains. And it's really difficult to know exactly what is going on there. I have put some gains for the Russians there in line with Syriac maps, and I've also put gains in line with Syriac maps here, but in a knowledge that that might not be the case, that it could be fluid, just not sure. But certainly pressure from the northeast and the southwest of Avdiivka, and yeah, we'll see how that ends up in the next few days, whether that is an area that the Russians are really trying a lot harder to take. They've lost a lot of personnel and mechanized equipment in this area over the last few weeks. So it looked like this was one of the many places they're trying to attack in their offensive phase, but they haven't had any meaningful success. Really, although some gains towards Krasnohorivka, but they're trying very hard to take that. ISW talks about how Milblog is saying that's really important for them to take Krasnohorivka in order to cut the E50 Donetsk City Pokrovska highway. To cut this highway and then to move on to other places behind there. But yeah. As we move on from Avdiivka, we come to Mariinka, which is nothing short of an apocalyptic hellscape. We've got just one line in ISW saying that Russian bloggers claimed that Russians have made advances in Mariinka, but that's not quite explicit enough for me. But it's certainly pressure around Pobieda, and I think in the northern area of the center of Mariinka. I haven't heard anything about that northern salient into the piggery and the agricultural warehouses there. And then we come on down to Vuhledar. ISW has a few things to say on Vuhledar. There is still, apparently Russian presence in these dachas, as according to pro-Russians. So contradictory claims again here, as ISW reports. So Russian forces did not conduct any confirmed ground attacks in western Donetsk. That's not Vuhledar. Russian milbloggers continue to warn that Ukrainian forces near Vuhledar appear to be preparing for an offensive against exhausted and vulnerable Russian troops. A Russian milblogger posted footage of artillery striking Ukrainian fortifications in the Vuhledar direction, and the DPR, Cascade Tactical Formation, posted footage of its fighters taking Ukrainian prisoners near Vuhledar on an unspecified date. So various things going on there, but not necessarily all happening yesterday. Unspecified date means that it could have happened a month ago. But claims of DPR taking prisoners around here. The Russians artillery striking the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians getting ready to hit the Russians back with a big counteroffensive because the Russians are exhausted in the area. All of those things could well be true. And then we come out to Zaporizhia and Kherson. As far as Zaporizhia is concerned, huge amounts of defences are still being built in Zaporizhia. Lots of reports on that. Trenches, Dragon's Teeth, all that kind of stuff. Routine artillery duels between the two sides. And then we come down to Kherson. And actually, there have been, so Syriac Maps reports on some gained Ukrainian land in the area. So where are they here? Situation in Kherson front. During the last 48 hours, Ukrainian army has managed to establish control over new areas east of Potemkin Island. Here, that area, a bit of grey zone, and Russians control some of the south of that. This is mentioned in the ISW that the Russians claim that they repelled an attack there, a landing of the Ukrainians there, but Syriac Map seems to go one step further to say they have taken land there. And in fact, I have updated I pretty much had a line straight through the middle of, really the two sides separated by the Dnipro River, but actually it's a little bit more complicated in this delta here because there's quite a lot of settlement. There's a lot of buildings, as you can see, in on these islands. So it isn't just that these are marshy, boggy river delta islands. These are, there are fishermen, there's all sorts of stuff going on there, there's industry and whatnot. So it is a bit more complicated than that. So I have updated my maps accordingly. Ukrainians have made some gains there. Russians have other parts of those islands under their control, and there's a bit of a grey zone there on this Potemkin island. So other than that, not too much detail of, say, Crimea, of any hits overnight. So much other news has been happening with Georgia, with the Nord Stream 2. It's difficult to keep an eye on everything, but hopefully that was useful. Please like, subscribe and share. I appreciate all of you. And check out my videos later. I might do 2 later. I looked at a Colonel McGregor video that someone posted to me, and I did a reaction to that. I only lasted 10 minutes before I gave up. I had that much of a problem with it. It is a bit of a rant. If you like my rants, you'll like that one. Anyway, I did get pretty angry. Take care. I'll speak to you later.